Welcome, history enthusiasts. Today, we drift into one of the most dramatic and devastating chapters in China's past, how opium tore through its society and shook the foundations of its greatest empire. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from the past. Get ready to uncover the hidden truths, the human stories, and the political chaos behind one of history's most gripping crises, China. For centuries, it stood as one of the most advanced and sophisticated civilizations in the world. Its rivers, mountains, and fertile plains nurtured one of the largest and most organized empires in human history. From the Great Wall that stretched across deserts and mountains to the grand palaces of Beijing, the scale and grandeur of China's civilization were unmatched. It was a land of invention, culture, philosophy, and power. The people of China developed intricate systems of governance, complex social hierarchies, and a refined culture that valued learning, family, and tradition. Scholars and inventors thrived in an environment that encouraged the pursuit of knowledge, leading to monumental achievements in science, medicine, agriculture, art, and literature. China had flourished through dynasties that rose and fell, each leaving an indelible mark on the country's history, shaping its identity and strengthening its position as a dominant power in the world. By the 17th and 18th centuries, under the Qing Dynasty, China had reached the pinnacle of its imperial might. The Qing emperors ruled over a vast and diverse territory, encompassing millions of people from different ethnicities, languages, and cultures. The dynasty had stabilized internal governance after centuries of civil unrest, expanded territorial borders, and implemented policies that encouraged economic prosperity. Cities thrived with bustling markets, trade routes connected the farthest reaches of the empire, and agriculture fed a growing population. Art, literature, and philosophy were celebrated, and the cultural influence of China extended far beyond its borders. Foreign travelers marveled at its sophistication, and neighboring countries often looked to China for political and cultural guidance. It seemed as though nothing could shake the empire's foundations, as centuries of accumulated wisdom, power, and influence created an aura of invincibility. But even the most powerful empires have vulnerabilities. History teaches us that external threats and internal weaknesses can combine in devastating ways. In China's case, that vulnerability would come in the form of a small, seemingly insignificant plant that would have catastrophic consequences. This was opium, a drug introduced by foreign traders whose arrival would ignite a crisis so severe that it would alter the course of Chinese history. It is difficult to overstate the impact of opium on China. While wars can destroy cities and armies can overthrow governments, a drug can erode an empire quietly, slowly, and persistently, weakening both its people and institutions until the foundations of power crumble. Opium did precisely that. Its arrival was not immediate in its destructive power. At first, it was a novelty, a luxury item that intrigued the upper classes and the foreign elite. Merchants saw it as a profitable commodity, something that could be exchanged for Chinese goods, and for a time it was treated as just another part of trade. Yet, the addictive nature of the substance meant that it was not long before opium began to infiltrate the lives of ordinary people. Families who once worked diligently in their fields, producing rice, tea, and silk, found themselves struggling with addiction. The population began to face a crisis not of swords or famine, but of habit, desire, and dependency. By the early 19th century, opium had spread into every layer of society. Farmers, artisans, officials, and even members of the imperial court were caught in its grip. Productivity fell sharply as millions of people devoted hours of their day to consuming the drug rather than engaging in work or civic duties. social cohesion began to break down. Families, the backbone of Chinese society, were torn apart as addiction spread. Children were neglected, and elders were abandoned. Communities once bound together by Confucian values and mutual responsibility became fragmented and weakened. The Qing Dynasty, which had once prided itself on strong governance, found itself ill-equipped to deal with this new and insidious threat. Efforts to curb opium's influence faced numerous challenges. Corruption among officials, coupled with the enormous profits that opium trade generated, made enforcement inconsistent at best and completely ineffective at worst. In cities and villages across the empire, opium dens flourished, often under the protection of bribed officials. Foreign traders, particularly the British, were determined to maintain their profits and used both diplomacy and military might to protect their trade networks. The situation escalated, transforming a public health crisis into a political, social, and economic disaster. But the origins of this catastrophe are just as important to understand as its effects. To see how opium became the instrument that weakened China, we must consider the broader context of international trade in the 18th century. Britain faced a trade imbalance with China. Chinese goods such as tea, silk, and porcelain were in high demand in Europe, while China required little in return. Silver flowed out of Britain and into China, creating an economic problem for the British Empire. To solve this, British merchants turned to India, a colony under their control, as a source of opium. Cultivated in large quantities and transported to China, opium became the answer to Britain's trade imbalance. What had begun as a simple economic solution would soon become a devastating weapon against one of the world's most powerful empires. The Qing government initially underestimated the danger. They saw opium as a minor problem, something to be dealt with at the local level. Early regulations and bans were issued, but enforcement was weak. The addictive nature of the drug meant that consumption continued to rise, even as laws were passed against it. Smuggling became rampant, and foreign traders exploited the empire's desire to control the substance. Gradually, the consequences of opium became visible not only in the economy but also in society at large. Farmers, unable to work their fields effectively, produced less food. Markets became unstable. Traditional industries suffered as laborers became increasingly dependent on the drug. Social unrest grew as communities were disrupted, and the moral fabric of the society began to unravel. Addiction became widespread, and the social consequences were profound. Beyond the immediate effects on productivity and social stability, opium also weakened China's political structures. Officials who were meant to enforce the law were bribed or became users themselves. Local administrations became corrupt, and governance was undermined at every level. The very institutions that had allowed China to flourish for centuries were compromised, leaving the empire vulnerable to external pressures. It is remarkable to consider how such a small, seemingly simple substance could have such a monumental impact. It was not armies, rebellions, or invasions that first shook the Qing Dynasty. It was opium infiltrating homes, markets, and institutions, gradually eroding the empire's strength until its power was no longer absolute. The story of opium in China is also a story of human weakness, greed, and exploitation. Foreign powers saw an opportunity to profit, while addicts were ensnared by their desire for the drug. Governments struggled to enforce laws that could have protected their citizens, and corruption ensured that the cycle of destruction continued. By the time the Qing emperors fully realized the scale of the problem, it was too late. The empire's resources were drained, its people weakened, and its international standing diminished. What had once been a model of civilization and strength was now facing a crisis unlike any other. Opium had introduced not just addiction, but systemic decay. Its influence penetrated every aspect of Chinese life: economic, social, political, and moral. It was an enemy unlike any before, invisible yet devastating, patient yet relentless. In retrospect, the arrival of opium can be seen as the beginning of the end for the Qing dynasty's absolute power. While the dynasty would survive for several decades, its authority was irreparably damaged. The Opium Wars would follow, opening China to foreign influence and humiliation. Internal rebellions would erupt, fueled in part by the social and economic disruption caused by the drug. The Qing Dynasty, once the epitome of imperial glory, was slowly crumbling, and opium had played a central role in that decline. This story is a reminder that empires, no matter how great, are never invulnerable. Sometimes their undoing comes not from conquest by armies, but from the subtle, corrosive forces that weaken them from within. Opium did not just kill individuals. It eroded the foundations of one of the world's greatest civilizations. It is a tale of wealth, greed, power, and human vulnerability. It is a story that resonates even today, warning of the dangers that can arise when profit is valued above people, and when a society fails to protect its citizens from destructive forces. The tale of China and opium is ultimately a tragic one. A nation of immense wealth, culture, and power found itself besieged not by foreign armies alone, but by a substance that infiltrated its homes, its economy, and its very soul. The Qing Dynasty, which had once commanded respect and admiration across the world, faced a challenge that would test every aspect of its governance and society. Opium, in its quiet but relentless way, began to dismantle the pillars of a civilization that had endured for millennia. And so, the seeds of destruction were sown, setting in motion a series of events that would forever change the course of Chinese history. What had seemed invincible, the power, the culture, the wealth, and the stability of China, now faced an unprecedented threat. The story of opium is not just the story of a drug. It is the story of an empire, its people, and the forces of human nature that can sometimes bring even the greatest civilizations to their knees. In the late 18th century, the world was rapidly changing, and China found itself at the center of a global trade network unlike anything it had experienced before. For centuries, the Chinese economy had been largely self-sufficient. Its people cultivated rice, wheat, and tea, produced silk, porcelain, and spices, and engaged in commerce that largely circulated within its own borders. China's population was enormous, its cities thriving centers of trade and culture, and its natural resources plentiful. Yet even as it flourished, the empire could not remain isolated forever. European powers were becoming more ambitious, more aggressive in their pursuit of trade, wealth, and influence. Among them, Britain faced a particularly vexing economic problem. British merchants and consumers had developed an insatiable appetite for Chinese goods. Tea had become a staple in British households, silk adorned the nobility, and exquisite porcelain set tables across Europe. These goods were prized not only for their quality but for their rarity, their exotic allure, and the status they conferred. The problem, however, was that China did not desire European products in equal measure. While Britain sent vast quantities of silver to purchase tea and other goods, China had little interest in British wool, manufactured items, or other commodities. This created a trade imbalance that was steadily draining Britain of precious silver. In the eyes of British merchants and policymakers, the solution seemed simple: find a commodity that China would want, a product that could be exchanged for its tea, silk, and porcelain, and thus reverse the flow of silver. The answer emerged in the form of opium, cultivated in India, a colony under British control. Opium was a powerful narcotic known for its euphoric effects and high addictive potential. It was inexpensive to produce, easy to transport, and crucially in demand in China. At first, opium had been known in China for medicinal purposes, used sparingly in small doses as a painkiller or sedative, but the British recognized a much more profitable use. They began exporting opium in large quantities, smuggling it into Chinese ports in exchange for silver, and, in turn, using that silver to purchase tea and other coveted Chinese goods. The British strategy was brilliantly effective in financial terms. Silver flowed back to Britain, tea shipments continued uninterrupted, and the merchants amassed enormous wealth, but the cost to China was immeasurable. What started as a trade solution soon evolved into a massive public health and social crisis. Initially, opium was consumed mostly by the wealthy and elite. Foreign traders and affluent Chinese experimented with the drug, enjoying its effects. In private, the imperial court, scholars, and merchants began to indulge, seeing opium as a luxurious novelty rather than a serious threat. This social acceptability allowed the trade to expand quickly. The British, recognizing the growing demand, increased their shipments, while Chinese smugglers began distributing opium across the empire, often with the tacit approval of corrupt officials. Soon, opium was no longer just a luxury for the elite. It had seeped into every layer of society. Farmers in rural villages, laborers in bustling cities, and even government officials became consumers. Addiction spread with alarming speed, altering the daily lives of millions. Productivity declined as workers spent more time seeking and consuming the drug than tending to their fields or fulfilling their duties. Families began to break down under the strain of addiction. Fathers neglected their children, mothers were unable to care for their homes, and social cohesion deteriorated. The drug's grip extended even into the halls of power. Officials responsible for enforcing laws against smuggling or consumption were often bribed, corrupted, or themselves addicted. The institutions that had maintained China's stability for centuries began to weaken under the strain. The Qing government, initially slow to respond, soon realized the magnitude of the problem. Edicts were issued banning the import, sale, and consumption of opium. Smugglers were punished, confiscations were carried out, and high-ranking officials were tasked with enforcement. Yet these measures were largely ineffective. Corruption ran deep, and foreign powers, particularly Britain, actively resisted enforcement efforts. They protected their lucrative trade routes and shipments, ensuring that opium continued to flow into China. This created a perfect storm, a society increasingly addicted to a dangerous substance, an economy losing vast amounts of silver, and a government struggling to assert authority in the face of foreign defiance. The social consequences were immense. Communities were destabilized as addiction spread. Traditional social hierarchies, which had been based on respect, duty, and family obligations, began to erode. Young men abandoned their responsibilities, elders were neglected, and social norms weakened. In many areas, opium dens became central to daily life, places where people spent their days consuming the drug rather than engaging in productive work. These dens were often protected by bribes to local authorities, and in many cities they operated openly, creating a sense of lawlessness and moral decay. The economic impact was equally severe. Silver, once the backbone of China's economy, was drained in massive quantities to pay for opium. Local industries suffered as labor shortages and decreased productivity affected agriculture, handicrafts, and trade. Tax revenues fell, further straining the government's ability to provide services and maintain order. Trade imbalance that Britain had initially sought to correct had now created a crisis within China, weakening its economy and undermining its sovereignty. Foreign traders, emboldened by the profits of opium, increasingly disregarded Chinese laws. Smuggling became a widespread and organized activity, often supported by powerful merchant networks. British traders, backed by their government, resisted any Chinese attempt to halt the flow of opium. Tensions escalated, creating a volatile mix of economic exploitation, social decay, and political vulnerability. The consequences of this trade imbalance were not limited to commerce or public health. The very fabric of Chinese society began to fray. Traditional values, rooted in Confucian ideals of family, education, and social responsibility, were undermined by widespread addiction. Communities that had once thrived on mutual cooperation and respect found themselves fractured by the pervasive influence of opium. Moral authority weakened as corruption spread among officials, and the public's confidence in the government began to erode. The Qing Dynasty, which had once been revered for its strong governance, faced a challenge that was unprecedented in both scale and nature. Unlike previous threats, opium did not march into China with armies or siege weapons. It arrived quietly, carried in small shipments, and consumed in private, yet its effects were no less devastating. It infiltrated homes, workplaces, and government offices, slowly undermining the empire from within. By the early 19th century, the scope of the crisis was undeniable. Millions of people were addicted, the economy was strained, social cohesion had weakened, and government authority was increasingly questioned. The king-emperors faced a dilemma: how to protect their people and sovereignty without provoking a military conflict with the foreign powers that profited from opium. It was in this context that a series of confrontations, later known as the Opium Wars, would emerge. But even before the wars began, the damage had been done. The trade imbalance which Britain had attempted to correct through opium had transformed into a national catastrophe for China. Addiction, corruption, economic instability, and social decay were now intertwined, creating a problem that would be extraordinarily difficult to resolve. It is important to understand that the introduction of opium was not simply an economic transaction. It was a deliberate act that exploited the vulnerabilities of Chinese society. The British merchants were aware of the drug's addictive properties, and their persistence in trading opium demonstrated a callous disregard for the human and societal consequences. This exploitation, combined with China's initial inability to respond effectively, set the stage for a profound transformation of the empire. Over time, opium would become more than just a trade commodity. It would be a tool of foreign power, a weapon that weakened China's economic, social, and political foundations. The addiction it caused would alter the daily lives of millions, the corruption it facilitated would undermine governance, and the tension it generated with foreign powers would lead to military conflict. In retrospect, the trade imbalance between Britain and China, which seemed like a purely economic issue, had far-reaching consequences that extended into every aspect of Chinese life. What began as a pursuit of profit evolved into a crisis that reshaped the empire's destiny. The lessons of this period are striking. They reveal how economic decisions, when combined with human greed and exploitation, can have devastating consequences. They show how foreign influence, when left unchecked, can destabilize even the most powerful civilizations, and they illustrate how a substance, seemingly innocuous at first, can grow into a force capable of undermining the foundations of an empire. The story of opium in China is a cautionary tale, a narrative of economic ambition colliding with societal vulnerability, of foreign profit intersecting with domestic weakness. The consequences were not immediate, but cumulative, growing over decades until they reached a scale that the Qing Dynasty could no longer ignore. By understanding this history, we can better appreciate the complexities of global trade, the vulnerabilities of even the most powerful societies, and the human costs of addiction and exploitation. The introduction of opium into China was a turning point, one that marked the beginning of a period of decline for the Qing Dynasty. Its effects would be felt in every corner of Chinese society, from the bustling cities to the remote countryside, from the imperial court to the smallest villages. The trade imbalance that Britain sought to correct had created a ripple effect, destabilizing an entire civilization and setting in motion events that would ultimately lead to conflict, humiliation, and social upheaval. In this light, the story of opium is not merely the story of a drug, it is the story of power, commerce, human behavior, and the fragility of even the greatest empires. The lessons of this period resonate through history, reminding us that wealth and profit, when pursued without regard for morality or the welfare of others, can have consequences far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The late 18th and early 19th centuries in China, marked by the rise of opium trade, offer a powerful insight into how foreign influence, economic ambition, and human weakness can converge to create a crisis of extraordinary magnitude. It was a turning point that would reshape China forever, a moment when trade became a weapon and a society faced challenges it was ill-prepared to meet. The implications of this period extended far beyond economics. They touched every aspect of life in China, altering social structures, undermining governance, and creating the conditions for both internal and external conflict. Understanding this context is essential to grasping the full impact of opium on China's history. It was more than a drug. It was a catalyst for transformation, disruption, and ultimately tragedy. And so, the story of China and opium unfolds, revealing a complex interplay of trade, addiction, social decay, and imperial vulnerability. The empire that had once seemed invincible now faced challenges that no dynasty had encountered before. The late 18th century marked the beginning of a period in which China would be tested in ways that would forever change its history, a period in which opium would play a central and devastating role, shaping the fate of an empire and the lives of millions of its people. By the early 19th century, the opium crisis in China had reached a scale that was nothing short of catastrophic. What had begun as a trade problem and a novelty for the elite had transformed into a full-blown societal epidemic. Millions of Chinese were now ensnared in the grip of addiction, their lives dictated by the daily need for the narcotic that flowed in from foreign merchants, farmers, artisans, merchants, laborers, scholars, and even members of the imperial court were not spared. The pervasiveness of opium consumption penetrated every level of society, from the bustling cities of the south to remote villages scattered across the empire. The consequences were profound, both socially and economically, and the empire that had once been the envy of the world now faced a crisis unlike any it had encountered before. In the rural regions, the effects of opium addiction were particularly devastating. Farmers, who had once been the backbone of China's agricultural economy, were now unable to work their fields efficiently. Rice paddies and wheat fields, which had supported the population for generations, fell into neglect. Crops rotted in the sun, and harvests dwindled. Families who relied on farming for their survival were pushed into poverty, while rural communities, once self-sufficient, began to collapse under the weight of addiction. Children were forced to labor in place of their addicted parents, disrupting education and development, while elders were often abandoned, left to survive as best they could. In cities, the consequences were equally severe. Artisans and craftsmen, who had maintained the cultural and economic vibrancy of urban centers, found themselves increasingly preoccupied with opium. Production slowed, markets became unpredictable, and industries that relied on skilled labor began to falter. The rise of opium dens in cities became a striking visual symbol of this crisis. These dens, often lavishly decorated, became centers of consumption where people spent their days in a haze of smoke and stupor. The dens were frequented by all classes. The wealthy could afford long hours of indulgence, while the poor, seeking escape from hardship, often spent what little money they had on the drug. Social norms eroded as public behavior changed. Once respectable neighborhoods became centers of vice as crime, gambling, and corruption flourished alongside opium use. The moral and social fabric of China began to unravel. Under the strain of addiction, Confucian values, which had long emphasized family responsibility, respect for elders, and social harmony, were severely undermined. Fathers who had once been protectors and providers became absentee figures, consumed by their desire for opium. Mothers struggled to maintain households amidst chaos, often succumbing to despair or addiction themselves. Communities that had depended on mutual cooperation and adherence to social norms found themselves fractured, with trust and communal bonds eroded. The psychological impact of addiction cannot be understated. Individuals became enslaved to their desire for opium, prioritizing consumption above all else. The physical effects were devastating: chronic illness, deterioration of the body, and eventual incapacity to work or maintain basic daily functions. Mental faculties were impaired, decision-making became erratic, and the ability to participate in civic or social life was severely diminished. The collective effect on society was staggering. Productivity across the empire declined, the economy faltered, and social unrest began to simmer. The once mighty Qing Dynasty now faced a problem that was unprecedented in scale and nature. The majority of its population was vulnerable, weakened, and distracted by addiction. Even within the imperial court, the effects of opium were visible. Some officials and members of the elite began to indulge in the drug, both as a symbol of status and as escape from the pressures of governance. Their indulgence undermined confidence in the administration, as decisions were made under the influence or delayed due to impairment. Corruption, already a persistent issue within the empire, intensified. Bribes were common, particularly among officials responsible for enforcing anti-opium laws. Foreign traders, aware of this vulnerability, often exploited it, ensuring that shipments of opium continued to enter the empire despite bans or restrictions. Enforcement efforts, though well-intentioned, were largely ineffective. Local authorities faced immense challenges in policing a substance that was now consumed by millions. Attempts to confiscate opium or punish smugglers were frequently circumvented by bribery, deception, or outright resistance. Even when seizures were made, foreign powers, particularly Britain, often intervened diplomatically or militarily to protect their interests. This created an environment in which law and order appeared inconsistent, further eroding public trust in the government's ability to protect its citizens. The economic consequences of widespread opium use were equally alarming. Silver, currency that had long underpinned China's wealth and trade, flowed out of the country in vast quantities to pay for opium imports. Local economies that had once thrived became dependent on an addictive substance, disrupting production, trade, and taxation. Agricultural output declined as laborers devoted themselves to opium rather than crops. Markets became unstable as the reliability of goods and services diminished. Cities, once bustling centers of commerce, began to show signs of decay. The silver drain caused by opium trade created an imbalance that further weakened the state's ability to maintain infrastructure, enforce laws, and support social services. The Qing Dynasty's authority was undermined at multiple levels, leaving the empire increasingly vulnerable to both internal and external pressures. The social impact of opium extended beyond the immediate effects on labor and productivity. Families, the cornerstone of Chinese society, were deeply affected. Relationships were strained or destroyed as addiction altered priorities and behavior. Children were often left unattended, neglected, or forced into labor to compensate for the parents' incapacity. Communities struggled to maintain cohesion, and traditional social norms, once rigidly upheld, began to erode. Education suffered as schools faced declining attendance, and young people were drawn into the opium trade or consumption. Religious and cultural institutions, which had served as anchors for social stability, found themselves challenged by widespread moral decay. The psychological and physical dependence created by opium also had a profound effect on governance and leadership. Officials responsible for administration, law enforcement, and policy implementation were often incapacitated by their own addiction or influenced by bribes. Decisions were delayed, Laws were inconsistently enforced, and policies designed to protect the public were undermined from within. The Qing Dynasty, which had long relied on a centralized and disciplined bureaucracy to maintain order, found itself struggling to govern effectively. This weakening of authority further emboldened foreign traders and smugglers who continued to exploit China's vulnerability for profit. The opium epidemic also created tension between urban and rural populations. Cities where opium dens flourished became centers of vice and corruption, while rural areas experienced economic collapse due to absentee farmers and declining productivity. The divide between urban and rural communities widened, and social unrest grew as both groups faced the consequences of addiction and economic instability. The strain on empire's resources was enormous. Attempts to suppress the trade required manpower, money, and coordination that were increasingly difficult to mobilize in a society where addiction and corruption were widespread. Enforcement efforts, while sometimes successful in confiscating shipments or punishing smugglers, could not address the underlying causes of addiction or the demand for the drug. The human cost of opium addiction was staggering. Millions of people suffered physical deterioration, psychological distress, and social isolation. Families were torn apart, communities destabilized, and social norms undermined. The labor force, which had once sustained the empire's economy and agriculture, was severely weakened. The Qing Dynasty's ability to respond to both internal and external challenges was compromised. By the time the emperors fully grasped the scale of the problem, the crisis had reached a point where traditional measures were no longer sufficient. The stage was set for confrontation, both with the foreign powers that supplied opium and with internal rebellions fueled by social and economic unrest. The pervasiveness of opium in Chinese society was unmatched by any previous social or political challenge. Unlike military invasions, which could be resisted with armies, or rebellions, which could be suppressed with force, opium's threat was invisible, insidious, and internal. It attacked the very fabric of society, undermining the physical, economic, and moral strength of the empire. The consequences were cumulative, growing steadily over years and decades. Communities decayed, economies faltered, and governance became increasingly ineffective. The social hierarchy, which had maintained order and stability for centuries, began to crumble under the weight of addiction. The empire that had once seemed invincible was now besieged by a crisis from within. Opium's impact on China was not limited to the lower classes. Even the elite, who had access to wealth and influence, were drawn into addiction. Scholars, merchants, and government officials indulged in the drug, often under the guise of relaxation or social custom. Their involvement lent legitimacy to opium consumption, further embedding it into Chinese society. The imperial court, tasked with preserving order and guiding policy, struggled to address a problem that had penetrated every layer of governance. The moral authority of the Qing Dynasty was eroded as those in power were seen to be either complicit or incapacitated. Corruption, bribery, and addiction combined to create a system in which law and order were increasingly fragile. As addiction spread, so too did social instability. Communities that had relied on mutual cooperation and respect for the law were destabilized. Crime rates rose as people sought money to purchase opium or became involved in smuggling and illicit trade. Public morality deteriorated and social norms weakened. The influence of Confucian values, which had long underpinned Chinese society, diminished as addiction and economic desperation reshaped daily life. Families, once the central unit of stability and governance, struggled to survive. Children were forced into labor or left to fend for themselves. Elders were abandoned, and communal bonds that had held society together were strained to the breaking point. The cumulative effects of opium on the Qing Dynasty were profound. Economically, the empire suffered from a drain of silver, declining agricultural production, and weakened markets. Socially, communities and families were destabilized, social norms eroded, and public morality was undermined. Politically, the government's ability to enforce laws, maintain authority, and respond to crises was severely compromised. The pervasiveness of addiction created a society in which nearly every aspect of life was touched by the consequences of opium consumption. By the early 1830s, it was clear that the empire faced an existential threat. The drug that had been introduced as a means of balancing trade had now become a weapon of immense destructive power. Its effects were visible in the streets of cities, in the fields of rural villages, and within the halls of power. No institution, no social class, and no region of the empire was untouched. The Qing Dynasty's reputation, both domestically and internationally, was at stake. The pervasive use of opium had not only created internal instability, but had also weakened China's position in the world. Foreign powers, aware of the empire's vulnerabilities, were emboldened to demand concessions, establish trade rights, and protect their opium shipments. Diplomacy was complicated by the presence of addiction among officials, corruption within the bureaucracy, and public unrest. The combination of social, economic, and political instability created a perfect storm, one that would soon erupt into open conflict. The stage was set for the Opium Wars, but even before the first shots were fired, the damage had been done. Opium had already weakened the empire, disrupted society, and undermined governance. It had become an invisible enemy, infiltrating every aspect of life and eroding the strength of China from within. The lessons of this period are striking and sobering. They reveal how a substance, introduced primarily for profit, can reshape an entire civilization. They show how addiction, corruption, and social decay can intertwine to weaken even the most powerful empires, and they illustrate the profound vulnerability of societies that fail to protect their people from destructive forces. The story of opium in China during the early 19th century is, at its core, a story of human vulnerability, exploitation, and unintended consequences. What had started as a trade imbalance, a seemingly minor economic challenge, became a national crisis with ramifications that touched every corner of the empire. By the time the Qing emperors understood the full extent of the problem, millions of their subjects were addicted, communities were destabilized, and the economy was strained. Enforcement measures were largely ineffective, and foreign powers resisted any attempt to curb the trade. In effect, opium had become both a social and political weapon, one that could erode an empire without firing a single cannon or marching a single army. The pervasiveness of the crisis, combined with the empire's inability to respond effectively, set the stage for a series of events that would forever alter China's trajectory: the Opium Wars. Humiliating treaties, foreign encroachment, and internal rebellions all stemmed in large part from the social and economic upheaval caused by this single substance. It was an enemy unlike any the empire had faced before, invisible yet pervasive, personal yet collective, and devastating in ways that armies and invaders could not achieve. Opium's impact on China was both immediate and long-lasting. The epidemic disrupted daily life, undermined governance, and eroded social cohesion. It weakened the labor force, drained the economy, and corrupted officials. Families were fractured, communities destabilized, and the moral authority of the state questioned. In short, opium changed the very character of Chinese society, creating vulnerabilities that foreign powers would exploit and internal rebellions would amplify. It was, in every sense, a crisis that would define an era. Early 19th century in China was thus marked by the rise of opium as a central and destructive force. The empire, which had once seemed invincible, now faced a threat that was insidious, pervasive, and devastating. The social, economic, and political consequences of addiction were immense, creating a society in which nearly every aspect of life was touched by the drug. By the time the Opium Wars began, China was already a weakened empire, struggling to cope with a crisis that had been decades in the making. And yet, despite the enormity of the problem, the story of China's struggle with opium is not merely one of weakness or failure. It is also a story of resilience, of efforts to resist, enforce, and protect a civilization that had endured for centuries. The conflict between foreign traders, addicted populations, and a struggling government set the stage for dramatic events that would reshape the empire, its people, and its place in the world. Opium had, by this point, become more than a drug. It was a force that would determine the fate of millions and test the strength of one of history's greatest empires. The king emperors, recognizing the destructive power of opium within their empire, began to take action to protect their people, their economy, and the authority of the state. The challenge they faced, however, was unprecedented. Unlike a foreign army that could be fought on a battlefield, opium was an invisible and insidious enemy, penetrating every layer of society, from the rural villages to the bustling cities, and even reaching the upper echelons of the imperial court. The rulers of China, long accustomed to maintaining strict control over trade, taxation, and governance, found themselves grappling with a problem that defied conventional strategies. Efforts to curb the opium trade began with legislation and official edicts. The Qing government passed laws banning the import, sale, and consumption of the drug. Local authorities were instructed to confiscate shipments, destroy opium stores, and punish those caught smuggling or selling the substance. Severe penalties were established, including imprisonment, exile, and in some cases, execution. These measures reflected the seriousness with which the emperors viewed the crisis. The central government understood that without decisive action, the social, economic, and political consequences would be catastrophic. Yet, despite the issuance of strict laws, enforcement proved to be extraordinarily difficult. The empire's vast size, diverse population, and complex bureaucracy created numerous opportunities for corruption, evasion, and noncompliance. Local officials, often underpaid and susceptible to bribery, frequently turned a blind eye to opium dens or smuggling operations. Some even became users themselves, weakening their ability to enforce the law effectively. The imperial court, though well-intentioned, was limited in its reach and ability to ensure that directives were implemented uniformly across the empire. Foreign traders, particularly the British, posed another formidable obstacle to China's attempts at enforcement. The British East India Company, which had invested heavily in the cultivation and export of opium from India, was determined to maintain its lucrative trade. The profits generated by opium were enormous, financing Britain's consumption of tea and other Chinese goods while maintaining the flow of silver into British coffers. When Chinese officials attempted to intercept opium shipments, the British often protested diplomatically, claiming that their merchants had the right to engage in legal trade. More dangerously, Britain was prepared to use military force to protect its interests, demonstrating that economic power could be backed by the might of its navy. The combination of domestic corruption and foreign defiance made enforcement extremely challenging. Smuggling networks flourished along China's extensive coastline and rivers. Merchants developed increasingly sophisticated methods to hide shipments, using fast ships, covert routes, and bribed officials to evade confiscation. Opium dens, while illegal, operated openly in many cities, often under the tacit protection of corrupt authorities. The very systems designed to maintain order now served to facilitate the spread of the drug. The human toll of the opium epidemic continued to grow as government enforcement lagged behind the scale of consumption. Millions remained addicted, and families continued to suffer the consequences. Fathers and mothers were incapacitated by the drug, children were neglected or forced into labor, and entire communities were destabilized. The physical and psychological effects of opium created a population increasingly incapable of sustaining agricultural production, artisanal crafts, or economic trade. The labor force, once the engine of the empire's prosperity, was severely weakened. This had immediate economic consequences. As crops failed, local industries suffered, and markets became unstable. Silver, drained to pay for imported opium, further strained the empire's finances. The government found itself not only dealing with addiction, but also managing a growing fiscal crisis. The Qing Dynasty faced an additional challenge in the form of corruption within its own bureaucracy. Officials tasked with enforcing the opium bans were often compromised by bribes, incentives, or personal addiction. Local authorities, who were meant to protect citizens and uphold the law, frequently profited from the very trade they were supposed to suppress. The imperial government, despite issuing clear directives and deploying inspectors, struggled to maintain authority in the face of widespread collusion. In effect, the state's own mechanisms for governance were undermined, creating an environment in which lawlessness and illicit activity could flourish. This erosion of trust between the central government and local authorities weakened the legitimacy of the Qing Dynasty. Citizens, witnessing the inefficacy of enforcement and the prevalence of corruption, began to lose confidence in their rulers. Social cohesion, already strained by the widespread effects of addiction, was further undermined. Communities that had once relied on the moral authority of the state to maintain order now faced uncertainty and instability. The response of the Qing government was further complicated by the presence of foreign powers determined to exploit China's vulnerability. British, in particular, leveraged their naval and military superiority to protect the opium trade. When Chinese officials attempted to confiscate opium, they risked confrontation with well-armed British forces. Diplomacy alone was insufficient to deter foreign merchants, who viewed the trade as an economic imperative and were willing to challenge Chinese authority through force if necessary. This external pressure compounded the internal challenges of addiction and corruption, creating a crisis of unprecedented scale. The stage was thus set for conflict. The imperial government, while attempting to enforce its laws, faced the dual threat of internal decay and foreign intervention. The result was a precarious balance in which the state struggled to assert authority, protect its population, and maintain sovereignty. In 1839, the situation reached a critical point under the leadership of Lin Zexu, a high-ranking official appointed by the Daeguang Emperor to address the opium crisis decisively. Lin recognized the severity of the epidemic and the failure of previous enforcement measures. He took bold steps to confront the problem directly, demonstrating both administrative skill and moral determination. Lin demanded that foreign merchants surrender their opium stocks, threatening severe consequences if they refused. He oversaw the confiscation of thousands of chests of opium in Canton and arranged for their destruction in a highly publicized operation. Lin's actions were unprecedented in scale and visibility, signaling to both the Chinese population and foreign traders that the Qing government was committed to ending the opium trade. The destruction of opium in Canton, however, provoked the very confrontation the Qing Dynasty had sought to avoid. British merchants, backed by their government, demanded compensation for the lost goods and protection for their future trade. Diplomatic negotiations failed, as both sides were unwilling to compromise. The British government, viewing opium as a legal commodity vital to its economy, was prepared to resort to military action. This escalation marked the beginning of the First Opium War, a conflict that would have profound and lasting consequences for China. The irony of the situation was striking. An empire that had flourished for centuries, known for its culture, sophistication, and governance, was now facing foreign military intervention because of a substance it had struggled to control internally. The opium crisis had exposed the vulnerabilities of the Qing Dynasty, both in terms of governance and military capability. The war that followed demonstrated the technological and Strategic superiority of Britain's forces. Chinese defenses, while formidable in the context of traditional warfare, were ill-prepared to confront a modern navy armed with advanced weaponry. Ports were captured, cities bombarded, and Chinese forces suffered significant losses. The conflict forced the Qing Dynasty into a position of negotiation and compromise, ultimately resulting in humiliating treaties. These treaties ceded territory, opened ports to foreign trade, and granted extraterritorial rights to foreign citizens. China's sovereignty, already challenged by internal instability, was further eroded by external pressures. The impact of the opium crisis extended far beyond the battlefield. Socially, the addiction epidemic continued unabated, further straining communities and families. Economically, the outflow of silver persisted, exacerbating fiscal instability. Politically, the Qing Dynasty's authority was undermined, both by the foreign powers that imposed unequal treaties and by its inability to enforce laws effectively within its own borders. The combination of internal decay and external pressure created a scenario in which the empire's future was uncertain. The consequences of opium for China were multifaceted. The addiction epidemic weakened the population, making them more vulnerable to exploitation and less able to resist foreign encroachment. Corruption within the bureaucracy reduced the effectiveness of governance and law enforcement. Economic instability, fueled by the drain of silver and decline in productivity, compromised the state's ability to maintain infrastructure and public services. Social cohesion, strained by addiction and moral decay, eroded the foundations of Chinese society. In essence, opium had become a tool of both internal and external destabilization, reshaping the empire in ways that went far beyond the immediate effects of the drug itself. The Qing Dynasty's struggle to address the opium crisis illustrates the complex interplay of domestic and international forces in shaping historical outcomes. The empire faced an internal challenge in the form of widespread addiction and corruption, a social and moral crisis that undermined productivity, governance, and cohesion. At the same time, foreign powers, motivated by profit and backed by military might, exploited these vulnerabilities to advance their own interests. The result was a scenario in which China's sovereignty, stability, and future were all at risk. In retrospect, the Qing government's response, while constrained by the limitations of the time, reflected a genuine effort to confront a problem of unprecedented scale. Officials like Lin Zexu demonstrated moral courage, administrative skill, and a commitment to protecting the empire from the destructive effects of opium. Their actions, however, were ultimately insufficient to counteract the combination of internal weakness and foreign power. The opium crisis had created structural vulnerabilities that no single policy or individual could fully resolve. The stage was set for a period of profound transformation in China as the empire grappled with the social, economic, and political consequences of addiction and foreign interference. The Qing Dynasty, once a symbol of stability and strength, now faced challenges that would reshape its identity, governance, and position in the world. Opium, which had been introduced as a trade commodity, had become a catalyst for systemic change. It exposed the weaknesses of governance, highlighted the consequences of corruption, and revealed the vulnerability of a society that had long been insulated from external pressures. The widespread addiction epidemic undermined social cohesion, weakened economic production, and compromised the moral authority of the state. These internal challenges, combined with military and diplomatic pressures exerted by foreign powers, created a situation in which the empire was forced to confront the reality that its traditional mechanisms of control were no longer sufficient. The story of China's struggle against opium in this period is a cautionary tale about the interplay between external exploitation and internal weakness. It illustrates how a single substance, introduced for profit, can have far-reaching consequences that touch every aspect of a society, From its economy and governance to its families and communities, the Qing Dynasty's efforts to enforce the opium bans, while noble in intent, reveal the limitations of authority when confronted with corruption, addiction, and foreign power. The failure to control opium trade and consumption not only weakened the empire, but also paved the way for foreign intervention, social unrest, and a decline in China's global standing. Ultimately, the opium crisis demonstrates that the strength of an empire is not determined solely by its military power, wealth, or culture, but also by its ability to protect its people, maintain social cohesion, and resist exploitation. China's experience in the early 19th century shows how vulnerabilities in these areas can be exploited by both internal and external forces, leading to consequences that resonate across generations. The Qing Dynasty's struggle to enforce its laws against opium, confronted by both widespread addiction and foreign resistance, serves as a pivotal moment in Chinese history. It highlights the complex challenges of governance, the impact of human weakness and exploitation, and the ways in which societies can be reshaped by forces both within and beyond their control. By the late 1830s, the consequences of China's opium crisis had reached a tipping point. The social, economic, and political pressures caused by widespread addiction, corruption, and foreign exploitation had brought the Qing Dynasty to the brink of collapse. The empire, which had stood as a beacon of civilization, culture, and governance for centuries, now faced a challenge unlike any it had previously encountered. The opium epidemic had weakened the population, drained the economy, and eroded public confidence in the government. Moreover, the refusal of foreign powers, particularly Britain, to respect China's laws and sovereignty had created a situation that could not be resolved through diplomacy alone. This fragile equilibrium would soon be shattered by the outbreak of the First Opium War. The immediate cause of the conflict was the decisive actions taken by Lin Zexu in Canton. Appointed by the Daguang Emperor to enforce the opium bans, Lin embarked on an unprecedented campaign against the trade. He demanded that foreign merchants surrender their opium stocks and cease further smuggling. When the British traders refused, citing the legality and profitability of their trade, Lin seized more than 20,000 chests of opium and destroyed them publicly. This act was meant to demonstrate the authority of the Qing government and to signal a zero-tolerance policy toward the narcotic that was devastating the empire. The destruction of the opium was both symbolic and practical. Thousands of chests of the drug, valued at millions of dollars, were destroyed in the harbor, a vivid display of resistance to foreign exploitation. Yet, this decisive move also triggered the very confrontation the Qing Dynasty sought to avoid. Britain, determined to protect its trade and assert its economic interests, responded with military force, marking the beginning of the First Opium War in 1839. The conflict exposed the military and technological superiority of the British forces. China's traditional defenses, while formidable against domestic rebellions and regional threats, were no match for modern naval artillery, steam-powered vessels, and disciplined troops equipped with advanced firearms. Chinese ports were bombarded, cities were captured, and the Qing forces suffered devastating losses. The empire's inability to counter the British effectively revealed a critical vulnerability. Centuries of self-sufficiency and insulation from external military threats had left China unprepared for the rapid technological advancements of Western powers. The First Opium War demonstrated that the combination of internal weakness and foreign intervention could bring even the most powerful empire to its knees. The outcome of the war was both humiliating and transformative. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, imposed severe concessions on China, Hong Kong was ceded to Britain, providing them with a strategic port and a base for further trade operations. 5 additional ports were open to foreign merchants who gained extraterritorial rights and freedom from Chinese jurisdiction. The financial reparations demanded by Britain drained China's treasury further, exacerbating the economic instability caused by the ongoing silver outflow to pay for opium. These concessions represented more than a loss of territory and revenue. They symbolized a profound erosion of Chinese sovereignty. The empire, which had once dictated terms to its neighbors and projected influence across Asia, now found itself forced to accommodate the demands of foreign powers. The social consequences of the war and the treaties were equally significant. Addiction, already widespread, continued to afflict millions. Communities that had been destabilized by opium consumption remained vulnerable, and the moral fabric of society continued to deteriorate. Families struggled to maintain cohesion in the face of economic hardship, addiction, and social unrest. The labor force, already weakened by years of opium use, faced additional strain as economic activity was disrupted by the war and the imposition of foreign trade regulations. Urban centers, which had once been vibrant hubs of culture and commerce, now bore the marks of military occupation, foreign influence, and social decay. Rural areas, struggling with absentee farmers and declining agricultural output, experienced famine and hardship in some regions. The social strain created by these conditions fueled internal discontent, laying the groundwork for future rebellions and uprisings that would further challenge Qing authority. Economically, the combination of opium addiction, foreign trade impositions, and war reparations created a crisis of unprecedented scale. The outflow of silver, which had begun with the introduction of opium decades earlier, continued and intensified. Markets became volatile, local industries faltered, and the government struggled to maintain fiscal stability. Tax revenues, already weakened by corruption and administrative inefficiency, were further reduced as the economy contracted. The empire's capacity to fund infrastructure, maintain public services, and support its military was severely compromised. This economic vulnerability made China increasingly dependent on foreign powers for trade and investment, further eroding its sovereignty and autonomy. Political consequences were equally profound. The Qing Dynasty, which had relied on a centralized bureaucracy to maintain order, found its authority challenged on multiple fronts. Officials tasked with enforcing laws and policies were often compromised by corruption, addiction, or foreign influence. Public confidence in the government's ability to protect its citizens and maintain order declined. The humiliation of the Opium Wars, combined with the concessions forced upon China, undermined the legitimacy of the imperial court. The perception of weakness emboldened foreign powers and domestic factions alike, creating a volatile environment in which governance was increasingly difficult to maintain. The First Opium War was only the beginning of a series of conflicts and crises that would define mid-19th century China. The Second Opium War, which erupted in the 1850s, further exposed the empire's vulnerabilities. Like the first conflict, it was driven by disputes over trade, opium, and foreign influence, and it ended with additional humiliating treaties that expanded the rights of foreign powers, opened more ports to trade, and imposed further financial burdens on the Qing government. Each successive conflict highlighted the cumulative effects of decades of opium addiction and economic exploitation. The empire's ability to resist external pressures had been severely compromised, and its internal cohesion was increasingly strained. The impact of these wars extended beyond the immediate military and economic consequences. Socially, the opium epidemic continued to destabilize communities. Families remained fractured, productivity remained low, and the moral authority of the state continued to erode. the psychological toll on the population was immense. Addiction created a cycle of dependence, despair, and economic hardship that compounded the difficulties caused by foreign intervention and internal governance challenges. The cumulative effect was a society in crisis, struggling to maintain order and stability in the face of multiple, overlapping threats. The legacy of the Opium Wars was also cultural. The perception of China as a powerful, sovereign empire was irrevocably altered. Foreign powers, emboldened by their military and economic advantage, increasingly imposed their will on the empire. Chinese intellectuals and reformers were forced to confront the reality of their nation's vulnerability, sparking debates about modernization, military reform, and engagement with the outside world. These debates would influence China's political and cultural development for decades to come, shaping the responses to internal rebellions. Foreign invasions and efforts at reform in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Internally, the combination of social disruption, economic strain, and political instability fueled a series of rebellions and uprisings. The Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, emerged in part as a response to the weakened authority of the Qing Dynasty and the social dislocation caused by opium and foreign interference. Millions of people were drawn into conflict, resulting in widespread destruction, famine, and loss of life. The opium epidemic, by undermining social cohesion and weakening the population, indirectly contributed to the conditions that made such rebellions possible. The cumulative consequences of opium on China's economy, society, and governance cannot be overstated. What had begun as a trade imbalance between Britain and China had evolved into a national catastrophe. Opium consumption had weakened the population physically and mentally, drained the empire of wealth, undermined the legitimacy of governance, and created conditions that allowed foreign powers to impose their will. The resulting conflicts, treaties, and social upheavals transformed China's position in the world, signaling a decline from the heights of imperial power that the Qing Dynasty had once enjoyed. It is striking to consider that the weapon that inflicted such profound damage on the empire was not a foreign army but a drug. Opium's effects were subtle, cumulative, and insidious, eroding the empire from within, even as foreign powers exploited its vulnerabilities. The Qing Dynasty's struggles to enforce its laws, maintain order, and protect its people illustrate the challenges of governance in the face of both internal decay and external pressure. The empire's decline was not inevitable, but the combination of opium addiction, corruption, economic exploitation, and foreign military intervention created a perfect storm that would be difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. The story of the First and Second Opium Wars also highlights the intersection of economics, morality, and power. British merchants and officials prioritized profit over human welfare, leveraging military force to protect their economic interests. Chinese authorities, constrained by internal corruption and the scale of the epidemic, struggled to assert sovereignty and protect their citizens. The clash between these forces reshaped China's economic, political, and social landscape in ways that would resonate for generations. The human cost of these conflicts and the preceding opium epidemic was staggering. Millions of people suffered addiction, poverty, displacement, and death. Families were torn apart, communities destabilized, and traditional social structures weakened. The physical and psychological effects of opium, combined with the trauma of war and economic disruption, created a society under immense strain. These effects were not limited to a single generation. They reverberated across decades, shaping the social, economic, and political development of China well into the late 19th century. By the mid-19th century, it was clear that opium had done more than simply addict millions of people. It had altered the very trajectory of an empire. The Qing Dynasty, which had once commanded respect and admiration across Asia and beyond, now faced unprecedented challenges to its authority, sovereignty, and legitimacy. The combination of internal weakness, social disruption, and foreign pressure had created a situation in which the empire's future was uncertain. The consequences of opium consumption, foreign exploitation, and the resulting wars would continue to shape China's development for generations to come. The Opium Wars, the loss of territory, and the opening of Chinese ports to foreign powers marked a turning point in the nation's history. They demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful empires to internal decay and external exploitation. They revealed how addiction, corruption, and social instability could be leveraged by foreign powers to achieve political and economic objectives and